What's up guys, it's Nick2. I finally hit level 100, so I'm going to be able to make way more content for you guys, so if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. I'll be uploading a ton more. But in today's video, I just want to talk about how you guys can literally double, if not triple, if not quadruple your damage by taking advantage of some things that really aren't clearly explained in the game, and talking about some of the stats that you guys want to be prioritizing on your gear and what pieces of gear you can actually get these stats on. This video is not going to be like a best in slot list for your character because it's really subjective and depends entirely on your class. If you guys want a video going over all of the really important defensive stuff in the game so you can become incredibly tanky and stop dealing with dying all the time, leave it down in the comments and I will make a video on that. There's a couple things you can do to make yourself insanely tanky. But anyways, let's just jump right into it. So the first thing that is really important to know is that the majority of the stats in the game are actually additive with each other, such as this all damage, damage versus crowd control, damage versus chilled, whatever. If I just have 95% increase all damage, you'd think, oh, that sounds really good. But it is not 95% extra damage for me. It's added with all of this other stuff. So at the end of the calculation, it's adding all of this, therefore it is affected significantly by diminishing returns. So this 95% damage, in the grand scheme of things, it really depends on, all the other numbers, but in the grand scheme of things, this could be only like 10 to 20% increased damage. It doesn't necessarily mean that these stats are bad, but what it does mean is that any stat that is not in this bucket or is not additive with each other is significantly more important and is the thing that we need to prioritize the absolute most. Those stats include vulnerable damage, crit chance, overpowered damage, and your main stat. There's a ton of different ways to get all of these stats, but let's just talk about each one real quick. So vulnerable damage is probably the single best thing in the game to get for your build. So if you aren't applying vulnerable, your build is significantly behind. As you can see, I have nearly 300% vulnerable damage, and personally, I'm actually missing a lot right now. So this is literally just 300% extra damage because it's in its own multiplier, it's in its own bucket. So getting vulnerable damage is unbelievably important. Overpowered damage is also its own multiplier, but most builds have a very hard time taking advantage of this. The chance is always going to be capped at 3%, but there's some skills that kind of get around this or have guaranteed overpowers. But for the majority of builds, overpower isn't something you're going to want to build into. If you're playing like Necro or something on Barbarian or like a very specific Druid build, it might be worth it to stack some overpower damage. The next one is crit chance and crit damage. You do need two stats for this to work, but this is still incredibly important to stack as much as humanly possible because, again, it's its own multiplier, and crit chance is incredibly hard to come by, so any source of crit chance you can get is going to be a massive damage increase. Sorks have a legendary that just gives them like 50% crit chance when they use their abilities at max mana, so that is unbelievably powerful. As a rogue, I have a really hard time getting close to crit chance cap, and obviously to take advantage of that crit chance, we need a lot of crit damage. The next thing is our main stat, which simply increases our skill damage. As you can see, I have 972 dexterity here, so every 10 points of dexterity is going to equal 1% straight up damage. So if I have 100 dexterity on my crossbow here, I have a little over that, 154. That's literally 15% straight up damage. Getting your main stat is unbelievably important. For rogue, it's dexterity. For other classes, if you just hover over, you'll be able to see which one is yours. Those are going to be the four main stats that you care about. Now let's talk about how we actually want to get those stats and which pieces they roll on. Real quickly though, I want to mention that there are a lot of multiplicative sources of damage in the game. Rarely it's going to be through, stats on your gear, other than the stats that I'm going to mention. Usually it's through like a legendary effect, through like edge masters or something that I have in my weapon here, or it's going to be like the unique that I have or in your skill tree. So for example, because I have advanced tooltip on, it's going to tell me that there's an X next to this, you deal 10x more damage to chilled enemies. This is different than if I just have damage versus chilled, because damage versus chilled is additive with all of this stuff. But this is literally, I just do 10 times, or not 10 times, 10% more damage to enemies versus chilled. It's as simple as that. And then I have even more of that in my skill tree here. There's glyphs that have it. You can see it in the Paragon board, 10x increased damage, 5x increased damage. So that is one way that you pretty much can take advantage of the same thing that I'm mentioning here. When it comes to which pieces of gear actually roll with all these stats that we care about, the main pieces are going to be gloves, your weapons, your rings, and your amulet. There's one other thing I need to mention really quickly in this video is that attack speed is very important for certain classes. As you can see here, this doesn't display in the game, but if you're playing sorcerer, for example, a lot of your skills actually have an attack speed multiplier. So like this one, for example, has an attack speed multiplier of 1.25, which makes it very important to get attack speed pretty much wherever you can get it. Whereas a lot of other skills, such as frozen orb, doesn't have any interaction with attack speed. I would just go on this website, check if your main skill has an attack speed multiplier. If it does, attack speed is simply just way more important than it otherwise would have been. Don't worry about it too much though, because it's a little bit difficult to get attack speed. So first off, we're going to talk about gloves. As you can see here, gloves have one of the most important stats in the game, which is ranks to your core skill. So for an example here, my Twisting Blades does 101% of my weapon damage currently with a max roll, as you can see at the very bottom there. If I put on my gloves, plus 4 ranks of Twisting Blades, that goes all the way up to 130% damage. So I pretty much just made my Twisting Blades do 30% more damage, which is unbelievably strong and is simply probably the best stat that you can get, because all the damage that you're doing is scaling off of this. Like, my Twisting Blade says it's only 19,000 damage, right? But I hit for like well over 900,000 at this point. That's also why getting weapons with incredibly high damage per second is probably the most important thing outside of getting ranks to your core skill, because this is literally what this weapon damage percent is going to scale off of. If I take off my weapon, that 19,000 went down to 8,000. Side tangent aside, the gloves are insane because you can get those ranks to core skills, but you can also get up to 10 to like 15% critical strike chance on your gloves, which is unbelievable. It's very difficult to get crit in this game. I only have 35%, so the fact that literally a third of that is coming from my gloves is unbelievable. And if you're a class that needs a lot of attack speed, gloves can also roll roughly 15% attack speed, so that's unbelievably good. Similar to gloves is rings. Rings can roll a trifecta of unbelievable stats, giving you crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerable damage in incredibly high portions. So the main thing that you care about on your ring, look, you can get up to 7.5% crit chance on your rings. You get 2 rings like that, boom, that's 15% crit chance. The amount of crit damage and vuln damage on this is insane. So on rings, you just want to prioritize those 3 stats. If it doesn't have at least a combination of 2 of those, you can probably just immediately get rid of it, because they are literally just 5 times better than the other stats that you could otherwise get. Your amulet can also get some pretty insane stats. Unfortunately, you can't get vulnerable damage or like critical strike chance or damage, but what you can get is ranks to certain passives. So for example, I have +3 ranks to the Frigid Finesse passive, which, like I was mentioning earlier, is literally giving me a total of 15% increased damage to chilled enemies. There's also another passive, Weapon Mastery, which basically does the same thing, but also on your amulet you can get percentage increase to your main stat. So I could get up to literally 11% increase to dexterity, which is just going to scale the more dexterity that I end up getting, which is unbelievably powerful. Next, let's talk about your weapons. So this is a little bit convoluted because it kind of depends on class, but certain weapons actually have different inherent stats. So for example, swords are always going to have critical strike damage at the top here. Crossbows are always going to have vulnerable damage at the top here, which makes them incredibly good. Also, depending upon the weapon that you're using, they will have different attack speed. So swords have an attack speed of 1.1, while daggers have an attack speed of 1.0. This is also going to change if you're using like a staff versus a wand, etc. I do not know the perfect set of stats for every single other class, but basically just use your own judgment. Typically you want to use whatever weapon has either the single best like inherent stats, such as the vulnerable damage here. So on a rogue, I kind of always want to use a crossbow because the vulnerable damage is really good. Or on a sorcerer, you always want to use a wand because the attack speed is going to be better. Outside of the inherent roll, all the rolls that you can get on every single weapon type is going to be the same. So the trifecta that you want is going to be vulnerable damage, whatever your main stat is, and then critical strike damage, like I have on this insanely, actually like best in slot crossbow that I got a super long time ago. So as you can see here on my crossbow, I have those stats, and then on my weapon here I also have crit damage from the inherent, and then crit damage again, and then vulnerable damage, and then your main stat. The fourth stat can kind of just be whatever you want. Generally, I think getting core skill damage is probably going to be your best. Anything that's conditional, like damage to chilled, is usually just worse than something that is just going to work all the time. So as a rogue, I would prefer to just have damage to close on everything if I could, because anything that's conditional is simply just going to be up less often. My perfect sword would be critical strike damage, dexterity, vulnerable damage, and then instead of this core skill damage, I would way rather have critical strike damage because that's on its own multiplier, and then the damage to close is always up and going to work for all of my skills. Another great thing you can do is slap in emeralds, or you can even do sapphires for critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. I'm pretty much permanently applying vulnerable, so I would prefer to have critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, but a lot of people do sapphires because that's crit damage against crowd controlled enemies. Again, it's conditional, where vulnerable I kind of just have up all of the time, and this is a crazy source of additional crit damage. If I were to have all royal emeralds in here, that's 48% increased critical strike damage, which is really high. So yeah, taking advantage of emeralds is insane. That's pretty much going to be it for the video. As a final TLW for those of you that don't really want to watch the entire thing, if you're watching the TLW, drop a like. Basically, vulnerable damage is the single best stat in the game. Next to that, critical strike damage is unbelievably good. Dexterity, or whatever your main stat is also probably the third best. Could even be better than crit damage, but it depends on your crit chance. On your gloves, you need to make sure to get ranks to Twisting Blades, or not ranks to Twisting Blades, but ranks to whatever your core skill is. Get crit chance. Attack speed is incredibly good. On your weapon, make sure to get the trifecta of vulnerable damage, crit damage, and your main stat. On your rings, make sure to get the trifecta of crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerable damage. On the amulet, if you have the room for it, amulet has a lot of survivability oriented things, but on your amulet, if you have the room for it, try to get a percentage for your main stat, because that's just a massive damage increase. And also ranks to extra passives that are going to increase your damage, such as glass cannon, or the ranks that I have like weapon mastery, is going to be really good. Make sure to stock it in emeralds because all of that is on its own multiplier as well. But that's it for the video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.